Hello, set-apart saints. This is David, and in the previous videos about the time of Great Tribulation in the Olivet Discourse, we've seen how hundreds of thousands of Jews died from infighting in Jerusalem, from crucifixion when they tried to escape, and from evisceration. The normal burial place is outside the walls of Jerusalem, but that wasn't an option. So the bodies were either being stacked up in the city or thrown into the valleys that surround Jerusalem. The scene and smell had to be horrifying, and wild animals and birds fed on their flesh. When the Roman armies trapped them in Jerusalem, the warring factions pursued destroying one another and the innocent inhabitants. Josephus says, "For they returned to their former madness, and separated one from another, and fought it out, and they did everything that the besiegers could desire them to do. For they never suffered from the Romans anything worse than they made each other suffer. Nor was there any misery endured by the city, which, after what these men did, could be esteemed new. It was most of all unhappy before it was overthrown, and those that took it did it a kindness. For I venture to say that the sedition destroyed the city, and the Romans destroyed the sedition. This was a much harder thing to do than to destroy the walls, so that we may justly ascribe our misfortunes to our own people." So he's saying that the Jews are responsible for the destruction of the city. Keep that in mind. George Peter Holford, in the book The Destruction of Jerusalem from 1805, said, "Of the desolating disposition which now governed the Roman army, the history of the Jewish war, and especially of the final demolition of the Holy City, presents an awful and signal example. Jerusalem was not captured merely, but with its celebrated temple laid in ruins. Lest, however, the army of Titus should not be sufficiently designated by this expression, our Lord add, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." The Jewish state, indeed, at this time, was fitly compared to a carcass. The scepter of Judah, its civil and political authority, the life of its religion, and the glory of its temple were departed, and no supplies whatever could now enter the walls. The famine rapidly extended itself, and increasing in horror, devoured whole families. The tops of houses and the recesses of the city were covered with the carcasses of women, children, and aged men. The young men appeared like specters in the places of public resort and fell down lifeless in the streets. The dead were too numerous to be interred, and many expired in the performance of this office. The public calamity was too great for lamentation. Silence and, as it were, a black and deadly night overspread the city. But even such a scene could not awe the robbers. They spoiled the tombs and stripped the dead of their grave clothes with an unfeeling and wild laughter. They tried the edges of their swords on their carcasses, and even on some that were yet breathing. While Simon Goras chose this melancholy and awful period to manifest the deep malignity and cruelty of his nature in the execution of the high priest Matthias and his 3 sons, whom he caused to be condemned as favorers of the Romans. The father, in consideration of his having opened the city gates to Simon, begged that he might be executed previously to his children. But the unfeeling tyrant gave orders that he should be dispatched in the last place, and in his expiring moments insultingly asked him whether the Romans could then relieve him. The report of these calamities excited pity in the Romans, and in a particular manner affected Titus, who, while surveying the immense number of dead bodies which were piled up, raised his hands towards heaven, and appealing to the Almighty, solemnly protested that he had not been the cause of these deplorable calamities, which indeed the Jews, by their unexampled wickedness, rebellion, and obstinacy, had brought down upon their own heads. The city of Jerusalem had 3 basic defense walls: the outer third wall, the inner second wall, and the upper city first wall. Most of the city is surrounded by the valley of Hinnom and the Kidron Valley, which provide a natural defense. But the northwest part of the city was more vulnerable, which is why there was a third wall built to provide an initial defense. The Romans battled the Jews to penetrate the outer third wall, which gave them access to the second wall. After much battling, they penetrated the second wall to come against the upper city, where the last of the Jewish factions held strong. To make his attack easier, Titus ordered the Fort Antonia torn down to its foundations. What is called the Temple Mount is actually the mount of Roman Antonia Fortress, which overlooked the temple. The Roman army used catapults, which launched stones over the temple walls, killing priests and worshippers, splattering their blood on the very altar itself. Messiah laid down his life so that his blood atoned for our sins as our high priest, and now the Jews' blood was being poured out even in their temple. Josephus says Simon Bar-Giora places previously captured Roman artillery on the walls opposite the works, but his men are inexperienced with their use. Titus positions artillery in front of his engineers for protection. The 10th Legion has the best artillery, capable of sending a 1-talent, 75-pound stone a distance of 2 stadia, which is a quarter mile. The Judeans place observers on the walls to warn of the incoming missiles, which are clearly visible white stones, allowing them time for their men to take cover. The Romans respond with stealth technology when they paint the stones black. The chiefs of the Idumeans send emissaries to surrender to Titus, but Simon discovers the plot and executes the conspirators. There are masses of deserters to the Romans, most of whose lives are spared by Titus. Over 40,000 captured citizens are released by the Romans, but the rebels, including women and children, are sold as slaves. Due to the excess of supply, they are priced low. The rebels flee into the city and ask for counsel with Titus. Titus lectures them and offers to spare their lives if they surrender. The rebels reply they cannot accept his offer, having sworn never to do so. Instead, they ask to be freed into the desert. An angry Titus ends the talks and orders troops to burn and sack the city. So once again, we see that the Jews caused the city to be sacked. Recall that the Jewish leaders encircled Messiah, and they hid him, and they spit on him, and they mocked him, and they delivered him up to be killed. And now Messiah has caused the Roman soldiers to encircle Jerusalem and mock the Jews about the desolation to come. George Peter Holford says, on the appearance of the Roman army, the factious Jews united and rushing furiously out of the city, repulsed the 10th Legion, which was with difficulty preserved. This event caused a short suspension of hostilities, and, by opening the gates, gave an opportunity to such as were so disposed to make their escape, which before this they could not have attempted without interruption, from the suspicion that they wished to revolt to the Romans. This success inspired the Jews with confidence, and they resolved to defend their city to the very uttermost, but it did not prevent the renewal of their civil broils. The faction under Eleazar, having dispersed and arranged themselves under the 2 other leaders, John and Simon, there ensued a scene of the most dreadful contention, plunder, and conflagration. The middle space of the city being burnt, and the wretched inhabitants made the prize of the contending parties. When at last the Romans gained entrance into the city, the soldiers had become so exasperated by the stubborn resistance of the Jews that they could not be restrained from wreaking vengeance upon the survivors, so they indulged in slaughter until weary of it. Josephus gave the following account of one part of the massacre when the city was taken. And now rushing into the city, they slew whomsoever they found, without distinction, and burnt the houses and all the people who had fled into them. And when they entered for the sake of plunder, they found whole families of dead persons, and houses full of carcasses destroyed by famine. Then they came out with their hands empty. And though they thus pitied the dead, they had not the same emotion for the living, but killed all they met, whereby they filled the lanes with dead bodies. The whole city ran with blood, insomuch that many things which were burning were extinguished by the blood. 10,000 Jews died around the burning temple, with their blood pouring out as they tried to protect it. Priests were still hiding in the Holy of Holies. When they surrendered, Titus executed them, as it was fitting for priests to perish with their temple. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed by the Roman sword, which brings to mind Messiah's parable in Luke 19:27, which finishes with, "But those mine enemies, which would say that I should not reign over them, bring hither and slay them before me." Sadly, the Jews who rejected their promised Messiah were slain by the Roman army in 70 AD. Keep in mind that Titus wanted to preserve the beautiful temple, but Messiah's prophetic word prevailed. Trying to save the temple was costing him too many soldiers. Titus decided to eradicate Jerusalem, a decision that Josephus blamed on the rebels. The rebellion destroyed the city, and the Romans destroyed the rebellion. This fulfills Daniel 9:26, which says that the people of the prince, the Jews, destroy the city and temple. They did that by rejecting their promised Messiah, so it was their punishment. They did that by attacking the fleeing army of Cestius, killing thousands of soldiers, which incited the ire of the Roman emperor, who responded by sending 3 mighty legions to take the Jews captive. And they did it by causing the peaceable Titus to grieve so much at their wickedness that he ordered the temple and city to be destroyed. The Jewish rebels set fire to the portico, which connected the temple to Antonia Fortress, to try to prevent the Roman soldiers from attacking them via that route. Josephus seems to say that the Jews caused the fire in the temple on the 10th of Aviv, which is the exact same day that the Babylonians had burnt the temple down before. Josephus records, so Titus retired into the tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day, early in the morning, with his whole army, and to encamp round about the holy house. But, as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it to the fire, and now that fatal day was come, according to the revolution of the ages. It was the 10th day of the month of Aviv, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves, and were occasioned by them. For upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while, and then attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning in the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight, and proceeded as far as the holy house itself, at which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upwards, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard upon it. Titus was given the news. He attempts to order the fire extinguished, but is either not heard or ignored. Battle rages around the altar. Titus enters the sanctuary to view its contents. The interior is not yet on fire, and seeing that the building can still be saved, Titus makes a second attempt to have the fire put out. But when he exits the building, one who had entered with him thrust the firebrand through the hinges of the gate. The interior of the sanctuary was now on fire. Thus, against Caesar's wishes, was the temple set on fire. Titus again commanded them to put it out, but there was such a noise and confusion at the time that the soldiers either could not hear him, or they pretended not to hear him. They were so enraged at the Jews that they ignored their leader and hurled torches into the sanctuary. Josephus provides an eyewitness account of the destruction, the fire, and the noise. You would indeed have thought that the temple hill was boiling over from its base, being everywhere one mass of flame. Yet the stream of blood was even more copious than the flames. Titus and his officers were now compelled to retire, and none remained to check the fury of the soldiers or the flames. The Romans, exasperated to the highest pitch against the Jews, seized every person whom they could find, and without the least regard to sex, age, and quality, first plundered and then slew them. The old and the young, the common people and the priest, those who surrendered and those who resisted, were equally involved in this horrible and indiscriminate carnage. The Roman legions made the most horrible outcries. The rebels, finding themselves exposed to the fury of both fire and sword, screamed dreadfully, while the unhappy people, who were pent up between the enemy and the flames, deplored their situation in the most pitiable complaint. Those on the hill and those in the city seemed mutually to return the groans of each other. Such as were expiring through famine were revived by this hideous scene, and seemed to acquire new spirits to deplore their misfortunes. The lamentations of the city were re-echoed from the adjacent mountains and places beyond Jordan. The flames which enveloped the temple were so violent and impetuous that the lofty hill on which it stood appeared, even from its deep foundations, as one large body of fire. The blood of the sufferers flowed in proportion to the rage of this destructive element, and the number of the slain exceeded all calculation. The ground could not be seen for the dead bodies, over which the Romans trampled in pursuit of the fugitives, while the crackling noise of the devouring flames mingled with the clamor of arms. The groans of the dying and the shrieks of despair augmented the tremendous horror of a scene to which the pages of history can furnish no parallel. It was a horrible scene in all senses, to the eyes, to the nose, to the ears, to the heart. Up to the very day of the capture of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD, the Jews were deceived by false prophets and were fatuously looking for a miraculous intervention on their behalf. The Roman soldiers stole everything in the temple area, and the Jews who had hid in the temple for safety were butchered as they tried to flee. The Romans did not pity age or rank, priests or laymen. They massacred them all, so that around the altar were heaps of corpses, causing streams of blood to flow down the sanctuary steps. And what is seen? Messiah died as the Passover lamb, so that bloody temple sacrifices were not needed anymore. But the defiant Jews, who rejected the promised Messiah, kept offering bloody sacrifices in the temple, and now it was their blood that filled the temple. George Peter Holford says, for 5 days after the destruction of the temple, the priest who had escaped sat, pining with hunger, on top of its broken walls. At length they came down and humbly asked the pardon of Titus, which however he refused to grant them, saying that, as the temple, for the sake of which he would have spared them, was destroyed, it was but fit that its priests should perish also, whereupon he commanded that they should be put to death. The leaders of the factions, being now pressed on all sides, begged a conference with Titus, who offered to spare their lives, provided that they would lay down their arms. With this reasonable condition, however, they refused to comply, upon which Titus, exasperated by their obstinacy, resolved that he would hereafter grant no pardon to the insurgents, and ordered a proclamation to be made to this effect. The Romans had now full license to ravage and destroy. Early the following morning they set fire to the castle, the register office, the council chamber, and the palace of the Queen Helena, and then spread themselves throughout the city, slaughtering wherever they came, and burning the dead bodies which were scattered over every street, and on the floors of almost every house. In the royal palace, where immense treasures were deposited, the seditious Jews murdered 8,400 of their own nation, and afterwards plundered their property. Prodigious numbers of deserters, also, who escaped from the tyrants and fled into the enemy's camp, were slain. The soldiers, however, at length, weary of killing, and satiated with the blood which they had spilt, laid down their swords, and sought to gratify avarice. For this purpose they took the Jews, together with their wives and families, and publicly sold them, like cattle in a market. At a very multitude were exposed to sale, while the purchasers were few in number. And now were fulfilled the words of Moses, and ye shall be sold for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. The walls of the city being now completely in possession of the Romans, as they hoisted their colors upon the towers and burst forth into the most triumphant acclamations. After this, all annoyance from the Jews being at an end, the soldiers gave an unbridled license to their fury against the inhabitants. After Jewish tyrants refused terms of surrender from Titus, he permitted the soldiers to burn down the Jewish government buildings, the archives, and their homes. The Roman soldiers found 6,000 women and children in an outer court of a surviving portico, who had been told by a false prophet to hide there, where they would receive guaranteed deliverance. While the Roman leader was deciding what to do with them, the soldiers set the colonnade on fire, and not a soul escaped. As the butchering ceased for the day, the fire spread through the night, so that when dawn broke, all of Jerusalem was in flames. This fulfilled Messiah's parable of the wedding feast, which was against the Jewish leaders who rejected him. It says, "But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city." According to Josephus, 1.1 million Jews died in Jerusalem, mainly due to violence and famine from the Jewish Civil War. But this number exceeds Jerusalem's entire pre-siege population. Many of the casualties were observant Jews from across the world, such as Babylon and Egypt. They had traveled to Jerusalem wanting to celebrate the yearly Passover, but instead got trapped in the chaotic siege. Luke recorded that the Jews would be killed by the sword and be led away captive, which Josephus documented, as the Gentile Roman army killed hundreds of thousands of Jews by the sword and took captives to be sold as slaves in foreign nations. It says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, trodden down by the Romans, until the time of the Romans be fulfilled." Josephus informs us that the captives taken during the whole war amounted to 97,000. The tall and handsome young men Titus reserved for triumph. Of the rest, many were distributed through the Roman provinces, to be destroyed by wild beasts in theaters. Many were sent to the works in Egypt. Many, especially those under 17 of age, were sold for slaves. Simon Bar Giora hid in the underground passages with his close followers. He attempted to tunnel his way out, but eventually gave up, and arose out of the ground at the side of the temple wearing a royal purple robe. He surrendered quietly to General Tyrannus Rufus. This alerted the Romans to the passages, which were then searched, and 2,000 bodies were found. Simon was ordered to be executed at Rome's triumph. John of Gessala gave up due to starvation and was sentenced to life in prison. In the next video, I'll finish the explanation of the time of Great Tribulation for the Jewish nation during the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 70 AD. That's all for today. I love y'all. Shalom.